When people hear the name Gig Young, born Salvatore Byron Ellsworth and later known as Byron Ellsworth Barr, they seldom envision the tragic undercurrent behind the suave smile that once lit up Hollywood screens. Born in 1913 in the humble setting of St. Cloud, Minnesota, he grew up amid economic turbulence and, through a series of odd jobs and a brief military stint, found himself drawn to the world of show business. Warner Brothers would eventually transform the unassuming Byron Barr into Gig Young, a charming and quick-witted performer whose sophisticated persona earned him the Academy Award for They Shoot Horses, don't they? Yet, beneath the polished facade, alcoholism, failed marriages, and deep-seated loneliness haunted him. In the end, the glamour gave way to a horrifying climax. In 1978, Young fatally shot his newlywed wife before turning the gun on himself. It was a grim finale to a career once brimming with comedic grace, a reminder of Hollywood's capacity both to exalt and to discard its brightest talents. Young's upbringing straddled the edges of poverty, set against the backdrop of the post-World War I slump. He showed early flashes of charm and presence, but his childhood was otherwise unremarkable, and there was little in St. Cloud to mark him for future fame. As a teen, he developed a love for performance, dabbling in local theater whenever he could, performing brief comedic sketches or dramatic readings at small-town gatherings. But the Depression pressed down hard, and finances were tight, so any dream of stardom remained distant. In his late teens, he drifted east, working odd jobs. He joined the Army for a brief spell, then found himself in radio as an announcer, still using his birth name, Byron Barr. That unassuming identity, though, would fade once Hollywood got involved. He auditioned for a small role in a Warner Brothers film, The Gay Sisters, 1942, and the studio execs insisted he adopt a name more striking. They collectively agreed on Gig Young, gleaned from a side character he'd once played. The newly minted Gig Young exuded a sophisticated, witty vibe that the studio believed would differentiate him from the dozens of similarly built, similarly ambitious young men flocking to Los Angeles. With the new name came modest roles in war-era pictures, mostly small parts or sidekick duties, but enough to keep him busy. The public discovered a refined, cool comedic talent, an actor who could bring a glimmer of sophistication even to a 5-minute cameo. By the late 1940s, Young had begun to establish himself as a stylish secondary lead, the sort of man who might play your debonair best friend, your sly comedic foil, or a cunning romantic rival. MGM, Paramount, and other big studios saw potential. Here was a plausible rival to more rugged stars like Clark Gable or William Holden. If they shaped him properly, they could market him as the thinking woman's heartthrob. He once told a journalist, half-jokingly, "I was supposed to be the perfect gentleman in a tux, offering wisecracks and a glass of Scotch." Indeed, the whiskey lounge persona that would later define him on screen was taking shape behind the scenes, too. He became known among the Hollywood circuit for never turning down a free drink, whether at a lavish wrap party or a quiet dinner at the Brown Derby. As the 1950s arrived, Young's personal life became increasingly chaotic. He'd married Sheila Stapler in 1940, right when his career was blooming, but by 1947, that union fizzled. Some said he was too busy climbing the Hollywood ladder. Others pinned it on his growing love of late-night parties and alcohol. In 1950, he wed Sophie Rosenstein, an actress's agent. Friends observed in her a calm, grounding influence that might stabilize him. But only 2 years later, tragedy struck. Sophie died of cancer, leaving Gig devastated and alone. He consoled himself with nights at clubs and with second helpings of bourbon, though a more productive dimension soon followed: strong supporting roles in films like Come Fill the Cup, 1951, ironically a drama about battling alcoholism. He earned an Oscar nomination for that performance, ironically reflecting the torment he was enduring in real life. But any idea that playing an on-screen drunk would quell his real-life habit proved naive. In the meantime, the sadness around Sophie's passing amplified his self-destructive impulses. His third marriage was to Elizabeth Montgomery in 1956. At that time, she was an up-and-coming star, later world famous as the witchy lead in Bewitched. Their union initially dazzled gossip columns, two bright Hollywood talents forging a glamorous household. But behind closed doors, the alcohol and Gig's frequent mood swings soured the romance. He harbored resentments about being overshadowed by her growing fame, and she loathed the nights he'd show up half lucid, stinking of Scotch. By 1963, the marriage ended in a swirl of heated arguments and allegations of emotional turmoil. Elizabeth moved on, soared to mainstream success on television, while Gig, now pushing 50, was left reeling once again, swirling in a cycle of boozy nights and diminishing film offers. During that same period, Young embarked on a fourth marriage, this time with Elaine Williams, 1963 to 1966. In the early flush of romance, friends hoped that maybe Elaine, seemingly down to earth, could anchor him. They bought a cozy home, talked about building a stable life, and welcomed a daughter, Jennifer. But the old pattern repeated. In the hush of evenings, Young returned to the bar, either outside or in his living room, nursing a glass of whiskey or gin. Word spread that he'd show up on sets, slurring lines. A 1964 project, The Rogues, ended with him replaced mid-season after blowing scenes or missing call times. By 1965, Elaine had had enough, filing for divorce and claiming spousal abuse in drunken rages. The pair engaged in a bitter custody battle over Jennifer, with the tabloids feasting on every lurid detail. Though no criminal charges were filed, the damage to Young's reputation was immense. He was once the debonair supporting star, but now the public glimpsed a man who might be dangerously unstable. Professionally, though, he caught a second wind when he signed on to They Shoot Horses, Don't They? 1969. This bleak portrayal of dance marathons during the Great Depression cast him as an oily MC, orchestrating the contestants' misery for the crowd's sadistic delight. He delivered a performance so riveting, so cynically charismatic, that the Academy gave him the Best Supporting Actor Oscar. At last, he had the gold statuette to confirm his real talent. Yet the same year, another fiasco struck. Judy Garland refused to work with him on a proposed TV special, citing his drunken behavior during rehearsals. He'd apparently shown up plastered or missing entire read-throughs. Rejected once again, he vented his wrath in a snide remark to a journalist, belittling Garland's own issues with pills and meltdown. The media jumped on it, painting him as petty and resentful, an ingrate who'd just tasted Oscar glory but still couldn't hold his tongue. The 1970s saw him drifting in and out of minor film gigs, mostly overshadowed by his rap sheet of bar brawls and public intoxication arrests. In 1973, an especially notorious scuffle in L.A. led to a $100 fine and a disorderly conduct record. Paparazzi captured the bleary-eyed star stumbling from the station. Industry execs, unimpressed, started labeling him box office poison. Even Mel Brooks famously replaced him mid-production on Blazing Saddles, 1974. Young had been cast as the alcoholic gunslinger Waco Kid, a role that seemed to ironically mirror his real life. But within days of shooting, Brooks discovered Young was too intoxicated to function. Thus, Gene Wilder was brought in, and the film soared while Gig sank deeper into the bottle. It was the starkest evidence yet that the comedic, sophisticated persona he once sold so convincingly on screen was now irretrievably corroded by the real demon of drink. By the mid-1970s, he was widely seen as a has-been, albeit one with a tarnished Oscar in his trophy cabinet. The loves of his life had departed, leaving him in a swirl of regrets. Yet, improbably, he found romance again with a woman named Kim Schmidt, some 30 years his junior, whom he'd met on the set of Bruce Lee's Game of Death, 1978. She was behind the scenes, working in some production capacity, and they struck up an odd rapport. Some say paternal, some say clingy. In the summer of 1978, at age 64, he proposed. She said yes, shocking friends who questioned the longevity of such a union. On September 27, 1978, they married quietly, with no big Hollywood hoopla, as he was by then a near-forgotten fixture. People prayed maybe this was his chance at a stable, redemptive final chapter, but the reality was far more sinister. Barely 3 weeks later, on the afternoon of October 19, 1978, tragedy erupted. In their apartment at 200 East 57th Street in Manhattan around 2:30 p.m., shots rang out. Neighbors heard screams, then silence. When management arrived at the door, they found Kim Schmidt, newly a bride, lying dead with a bullet wound. Gig Young, her husband of just over 3 weeks, also lay on the floor, a .38 revolver by his side, a bullet through his own head. No suicide note, no final phone calls. The crime scene signaled a murder-suicide, a final meltdown of a man who once enthralled Hollywood with suave, comedic grace. The coroner declared both died instantly. Though some speculated about possible murder by a third party, the police concluded that Young had shot Kim, then turned the gun on himself in some drunken or delirious rage. Autopsy reports found his system laced with alcohol and possibly Valium, fueling the narrative that he'd been half insane with jealousy or despair. The entire industry reeled at the lurid final act. The man who once teased the audience with witty barbs, and they shoot horses, don't they, had ended his life with real gunfire. On October 23rd, a subdued memorial took place in Beverly Hills. A handful of old colleagues, Elizabeth Montgomery included, arrived, unsettled by the grim coda. He'd prearranged no major funeral spectacle, so the service was small. His remains were transported to North Carolina for burial in Green Hill, near some relatives. The tabloids devoured the story, amplifying the tragedy that overshadowed any memory of his comedic timing or warm on-screen persona. In the weeks after, details about his will emerged, leaving an estate of around $200,000 to his daughter Jennifer, overshadowed by disputes from Kim's family who wanted clarity on the circumstances. The press spun it into another wave of scandal, suggesting that the once golden star was now recalled only for violence. The final punch to his legacy arrived in 1979, when Game of Death, the last film he'd worked on, albeit in a small role, finally released posthumously, capturing a faint spark of his screen presence. Bruce Lee had died mid-filming too, so the entire production carried an aura of misfortune. Audiences watched with macabre fascination, aware that 2 of the credited stars, Lee and Young, were dead. That synergy overshadowed the film's modest merits, leaving it labeled a cursed enterprise. Meanwhile, for Gig Young, it became the last echo of a once thriving career, a cameo overshadowed by personal demons. Over time, the story of his downfall blurred into Hollywood's long roster of tragedies, the cautionary tale of a star consumed by liquor, tormented by personal failings, culminating in lethal violence. So if you stumble across an old black and white flick from the 1950s and see a lean, debonair man with a quick grin, Note the twinkle in his eye as he fires off witty lines or sips a prop martini. That's Gig Young, leaning fully into the role of urbane sidekick or romantic second lead. But behind that easy charm lies a cautionary tale, a star undone by the same illusions he peddled, shackled by alcohol, battered by a cycle of broken marriages, and eventually culminating in that final terrible moment in 1978. The gunshots that ended him and his young bride remain among the darkest Hollywood heartbreakers. In that hush that follows the tragedy, you might recall the swirl of illusions Hollywood fosters, an industry that can turn a struggling Minnesota boy named Byron Barr into Gig Young, polish him into comedic gold, and then let him slip into despair. And in the hush, you might hear the faint echo of a line from one of his roles, something ironically breezy that stands in harsh contrast to the gloom of real life. That, in the end, is Gig Young, a charming comedic actor whose final fatal act overshadowed the bright wit and sly grace that once captivated a generation, reminding us that behind Hollywood's glamour often lurk ghosts of quiet desperation.